What's good, YouTube? Nobody here. Welcome to the second episode of Space Engineers. In the last episode, we concentrated on finding a spot for and beginning to build our base. In this episode, we will be concentrating on getting a refinery and assembler going so we can up production. Be sure to stick around to the end to see the surprise. Now that we have our basic assembler and refinery up, it's time to go ahead and start planning out the base a little bit. So what I did here was I started with a 28 by 28 grid and put a block every 7 blocks. That way we can put in wind turbines so we don't have to worry about them interfering with each other. Next thing I did is went ahead and placed some wind turbines. That way we could boost our energy production. This will come in handy later when we're using more vehicles. The next step was to continue laying out the flooring of the base. When I ran out of hydrogen again, I finally got smart and decided to build a ramp up to the ship. And without the jetpack, this was actually a little more complicated than usual. If you're new to the game, you can't actually nerd pole in this game, so you have to actually build slopes to get up. Finally, after getting a little creative, I could now reach my ship. While I was at it, I finally decided to go ahead and add a little platform just in case the ship decided to fall. The base is really starting to come along now. I can actually see what I want to do with it a little bit. Then I decided it was a good time to actually start working on the ceiling of the base. As you see, I actually decided to continue the pattern with the blocks so we can put even more wind turbines in. Next step was to actually work on the back wall a little bit. I decided to leave some room in there and not fill in all the blocks quite yet because I might decide to put in some windows later. I also decided, since we had a good spot for our landing pod, to go ahead and add areas for more vehicles to dock the same way. This actually took a little bit of time. I had to keep running back and forth to pick up materials and to make components. And then to continue this pattern, I decided to add more connectors in. Next, I decided to add an O2 generator because I was tired of running back and forth to the ship to get hydrogen. The next step was to actually place our first temporary refinery. Don't worry about the placement here. I do have plans to move it into its own room in the future. Production's at a point to where we need more than just stone for our refineries. So I went ahead and put my drill on my bar so I could control the drill myself. Right click down into the iron and began to farm up some actual iron instead of using stone all the time. I leaned forward very carefully and right clicked to get down to the iron. Once I got down to the iron, I basically cut through the iron with the right click, not worrying about how much we're wasting because we're going to be picking a lot more up later. And we won't have to worry about that. I just made sure when I got down to the iron here that I cleared out plenty of room for movement. That way we didn't hit the walls as we were working. When I'm using a ship down inside of an iron mine like this, I like to zoom into first person view. That way you can actually see what's going on. Just make sure you keep the ship level with the horizon using the Q and E buttons as you go. Because if you lean too far to one side or the other with this setup, we don't have enough thrust to keep us from actually hitting the ground. Once you feel like you have enough of your resource, just go ahead and slowly back out. Probably better to go to a third person so you can see everything a little bit better when you're ready to move out. I actually loaded up to about, I believe, 100k on this one and then decided to come out. If you need to, right click as you come out as well and you can actually remove all the stuff around you and it'll keep you from hitting the ice. Next thing I did was tested all the connections just to make sure that I was getting iron into the actual base and the refinery and the basic assembler as well. Next, it was actually time to go out and get some cobalt. There was some cobalt right next to the iron deposit, so I just went out there and hand mined all of this. The only reason I actually decided to hand mine was because I still had some iron and stuff in the actual ship and I didn't want to get it mixed up. Plus, you don't need a lot of cobalt, so one player inventory should be plenty. Once again, I just right-clicked down to the cobalt and then left-clicked once we got to the cobalt. The cobalt was actually for the metal grids for the refinery. Now that we're done with the refinery, we're going to go ahead and pipe this into the actual ship and the rest of the base. Now that we have a refinery, we're going to go mainly just for nothing but actual ores. It will speed up the production quite a bit. Next, we finish up the O2 generator. That way we don't have to keep running back and forth to the ship. Now that we actually have an O2 generator, I decided to go get some actual ice. I'm just left clicking on the surface, moving forward a little bit, and picking up as much ice as I can before I head back. Now that we actually have the refinery and O2 generator set up, it's probably a good idea to do some cargo containers in order to hold more, just in case we get too much. The next step is to go ahead and build the assembler. With the assembler complete, it's now time to start thinking about our first actual vehicle that is not the landing pod. In order to build a small grid ship on a large grid base, just drop a landing gear a little bit higher than the surface of the base. It'll go ahead and lock to the base and you can start building a small grid off of it. I like to build a column high enough to make sure that I've got plenty of clearance for the build. And then just move out a little bit. That way you've got a basic scaffolding for the ship that you're going to build, and you can just build straight off of this scaffolding. I like to start my builds with the actual cockpit. That way we can build everything around that. Just make sure you go down to, if you want to put it to the back of the cockpit like this. I didn't actually have enough there. So by starting with the cockpit, now we can put in a storage below. It would help if I actually had the interior plates. When you're building a ship and you just want to do a skeleton, I think the best way to do it is just to grab a bunch of interior plates and a bunch of steel plates. That way you can lay out the skeleton and come back later and weld it. I went ahead and welded up the cockpit and the storage container early. Don't ask me why I did this, I just did. For some reason I like to see those built when I'm building the rest of it. I guess it helps me figure out what it's going to look like when it's over with. Next I added the large thrusters that are going to be pointing down. These are the only thrusters that are going to be the large variety. The smaller thrusters, it takes 8 of them to fit the amount of thrust that one of the large has. So you actually save space by putting in the larger thrusters. Now with these thrusters, the reason why I have 4 of them is because you want 4 of them per storage box that you have. If you have a full storage box full of ore, it usually takes about 4 of the large thrusters to keep it afloat. So I'm adding 4 small thrusters per direction, that way we can maneuver the ship pretty easily. This may be overkill, we'll figure that out later. The main thing here is to figure out that you want the same amount of thrust in all of the directions except for the down direction. With this setup, I'm not going to add any thrusters pointing up because it's going to be set to actually mine in a downward direction. So in order to mine, you'll just hit the C key and move straight down. The drills will be on the bottom of this rig. I realized that I had one of the engines out of place in order to put another storage container in. I want to go for 2 storage containers because 1 is just not enough. It'll keep you coming back and forth a little too much. We're going to go big on this build, so it's a good idea to go in and make a pretty good size miner. Since we have another storage container, it's probably a good idea to add 4 more large thrusters. Remember when I said earlier that it's usually about 4 thrusters per storage container if you're completely full. The next thing I worked on is what actually I think makes this build extremely special. Basically, we're gonna be firing the drill straight down from the bottom of the ship. So I'm building a way to hook all the drills up. We will also have sorters in there to spit out any stone or ice that we don't want. We'll be basically cutting them on and off from the toolbar as we need to. So we start out with sorters and then connect. Yeah, I just realized that I made a major mistake here. We'll actually have to work on that in the next episode. Those sorters should not be where they are because that will not allow anything to come into the containers. But normally, this would be the way that I would do it minus the sorters. We'll go through the sorters in the next episode and fix that. So basically what I do here is I just build a grid and make sure that I leave my drills about 3 small blocks apart. By doing that, I believe that's the maximum distance that you can actually drill without losing any room. So if you bring them 3 apart like this, then you can spread them apart, which also helps because that'll allow us to line up the engines better. That way they don't burn your drills as you come through. I do actually mess with the engine placement a little bit here because I realize that I'm going to be firing down on my drills with these back engines. So if you notice they're a little out of place later, that's why. The next step was to make sure that the drills were going to line up. I decided to make the drilling platform a 4x4 for drills. So that's why I'm adding this piece that's coming out to the back. Also, it gives us a place for our batteries later. Now that I've got the grid complete, it is now time to start placing the drills. Remember, we're going to have a 4x4 platform here, so that's going to be 16 total drills. This thing will fill up pretty quickly. When you're running 16 drills, it's probably a good idea to put plenty of sorters and plenty of ejectors in your system. I haven't figured out the perfect ratio of sorters to ejectors yet. I'll probably do a video on that later, if there's any interest. In between these drills is actually a really good spot for the sorters. I decided to add those in later, which was a good idea, especially considering I'm going to have to remove the sorters from earlier. As I was doing this build, I was doing this basically on the fly. I didn't have anything specifically planned for it. I just knew that I wanted to do a downward facing drill. We're getting close to the point where we're going to have to start welding things up. So instead of showing all of the stuff for welding things up and all of that fun stuff, I'll probably cut that in between videos. Now that we have the drills, we have the storage, we have everything else already built, it's time to go ahead and start thinking about a way to connect to the base and then the batteries a little bit later. So I was playing around with the idea of using a conveyor tube here. I finally went with 2 of the conveyor frames in order to make sure that we could make contact with our other connectors in the base. Right here I just leave it as a single connector, but I did change that later. I do like the size of the smaller batteries, but I decided to go with the big batteries here because if we use the small batteries, it would take so many of them, it's not even funny. We would basically have armor made out of batteries. So I went ahead and put 4 large batteries in here. That should be enough. I can't guarantee that it is going to be enough, but that's the beauty of Space Engineers. When you're making a new build, you're going to actually have to mess around with it quite a bit and figure out what works and what doesn't. So here I'm actually moving the engines that I misplaced earlier. I noticed it when I went to go place the batteries that something was off. I was playing around with the idea of putting more engines on, but finally decided not to. I was thinking that with the extra batteries and stuff like that, we might actually need more downward thrust, but I don't think we were going to. So I decided to go ahead and get rid of those. And these extra placements here are not necessary. That was just me not thinking correctly. They would be necessary if you were going to run those engines where they are, but I ended up deciding to go with, 8 batteries overall, I believe. I started to think that 12 engines would be a little too excessive, if you know what I mean. Okay, so here we're starting to put in the batteries. I actually think they fit pretty nicely in these little slots right here. As always, hope you enjoyed the video. Since you made it all the way through, be sure to tickle that like button, leave a comment, and help the channel reach its goal of 1K subs. Also, don't forget the notification bell as well. In the next episode, we'll fix my blaring mistake and weld up the beast. If you want to see more survival-based content, be sure to click on one of the videos on your screen now.